Hello and welcome back to the Historical Humans podcast. Welcome to episode 4, Oral Histories and Oral Traditions. My name is Justin Woods and I am joined here by my two co-hosts, Gwendolyn Allen and Colum Coleman. And Colum, you just want to jump right into it? Let's start talking about some oral traditions, some oral histories.
All right.
You talk about it.
Yep. All right. Let's get into this. The big thing to distinguish here for us today on Historical Humans is the difference between an oral tradition and an oral history. Oral traditions are present in all societies at all times, regardless of whether or not writing has been invented or introduced to that culture, as it is simply the act of transmitting culturally relevant information from one person or one generation to another through speaking. Literally just using your words. If a culture can talk, if a culture can talk to itself, this is what it is doing.
Now,
Oral, sure. Oral history, on the other hand, is a much more academic term, and it refers to the act of sort of recording eyewitness or personal firsthand accounts of historical events, or even just essentially slices of life at the time. That's a very big distinction for us here, as conflating the two terms does occur a lot.
there, especially when you start talking about in the past, and it almost gets lost in translation, as ironic of a term as that is. But a lot of people just combine the two terms. They don't differentiate between them, and they're almost used interchangeably, even within the academic disciplines.
Yeah.
Yes, that was a very fun sandbag that I got hit with researching this episode. That was a very nice one. Hit me out of left field too, because before doing this, I didn't even recognize the distinction, which goes to show we are learning along with you as we make these.
But the thing that I really like about oral histories and oral traditions is being able to share this cultural information and pass it down, because a lot of these were oral traditions and oral histories have been around for millennia. They're older than any known written text, older than any known written documents, because before you could write it down, what was the way you would transmit the data? You would transmit your ideas. I hate that I sound like an academic because I just use data instead of saying words, and that was a complete Freudian slip. But I absolutely hate that. But it's the way you can tell stories and transmit information. And the thing that I personally really love about it and get really fascinated by it is, you would think that these stories would be forgotten or the details would change and shift, and in a lot of cases they do, but the way in which they're transmitted and they're told are in a narrative format. You tell a story, and as you're talking about the story, you're quite literally giving that information forward.
Yeah, I mean, also like sitting around and telling stories is one of the oldest ways that we bond and communicate with friends, with family. So like, I mean, I'm sure a lot of us remember being super young and telling stories with each other. And so you know, that's one of the ways that it really survives, because you're going to latch on to those. Um, and you tell them all throughout your life. So
Sitting around the campfire, fixing your stone tools, and just, telling a good old story, enjoying the night, enjoying the hunt.
yeah, I mean, even in the most like I don't want to say like rudimentary, but I mean, we even see like gossips today. Like everyone wants to talk about things with each other. That's how build bonds. So even though it's not, I would say it's not as important as oral traditions are done, as those are people's like histories and backgrounds and things, it's still that element there that, seeps into even now when we have, written language and even social media and things.
And Colum, what were you gonna add earlier?
And well, I was going to add into it with your lovely little caveman analogy there, is that this idea, oral tradition itself is fundamentally as old as the human race. One of the one of what we consider the defining characteristics about ourselves as a species is the ability to speak, to communicate through a form of language. And that is essentially what an oral tradition is the ability to talk to each other intelligibly.
And the thing that I love about it is just the fact that you have these designated storytellers, these characters, no matter what culture, no matter what language, what background, you always have that one person who's just designated the storyteller. And even in modern context, I feel like that storyteller, that persona still exists, because I remember going into like small towns in the deep south, and there's that old man sitting on his porch and just tell you stories about when he was young, or like people's grandparents telling stories of when they were kids. It persists so long, and it shares that information, and you may not remember it or recall it right away, but a lot of that has to do with repetition. You hear the stories enough, you're going to remember.
Yep. And just because I can get my my little ego boost in here.
Sophie,
as off screen, I do perform as a dungeon master in a game called Dungeons and Dragons here. And what is a dungeon master but a storyteller in communal storytelling, told literally almost exclusively through the oral tradition, because it's just people sitting around a table talking about things that never happened and never will. Making a narrative happen. And I have made Justin go and hide now. I am causing a emotional breakdown.
There we go.
So we all play D&D together. It's the same campaign.
evil dungeon master.
Even when like you're doing the dungeon mastering and we're in this world, you still tell oral histories and oral traditions, because you give us the rundown of the mythologies, of the histories of these people, which is really what oral tradition is for. They talk about religions, mythologies, histories, and culturally relevant information. And you do that through like the telling of stories, or even poems sometimes, which you guys got to hear it when he goes very in depth into this stuff.
Just for those of you playing along at home, Colum has a very strong fascination with a lot of European history. So there is going to be some entertaining conversation when it comes to, I don't know what, Greece, like the Odyssey, Homer, the Iliad.
Yes, I am a classicist. I have that degree.
You said that in such a tone.
Yes, but
I'm sorry, I can't do the British accent, or I'd made it even more smug.
I mean, you probably could. It's just you wouldn't be able to do it well. But
that seems like a great suggestion, Justin. Would you like to get into some of the various oral traditions from around the world that we have collected to look at?
Yes. Before we go into that, did you mention the organizations that are there for conducting oral history research?
No, we have not, and I suppose it would be due process to take notes of this. So there is... excuse me. So there is a sort of governing body that goes back to the 60s for the purposes of essentially regulating the standards of conduct for when academics record oral traditions, or when they take down oral histories, or even just in general the stories of the people that they are studying. This organization is called the OHA, the Oral History Association. If you are not in the United States of America, it is the IOHA, as they add on the term international. Because, of course, there's nothing more American than forcing a distinction between the United States and the rest of the globe. They cannot use the same acronym, apparently.
God forbid.
Yeah.
Oh, we must be special.
And this is essentially an oversight body that publishes recommendations and establishes guidelines. It's not necessarily like a government body in the sense that it has punitive measures beyond just blacklisting you. However, failure to comply with OHA is going to get you in a lot of trouble, both with them and probably with whoever you were talking to.
What if you were just a rogue storyteller? Like, you're the rogue oral historian, and you start a war with the organizing body.
That would not end well with you, as most people, especially people with strong ongoing oral traditions, they would probably not want to talk to you simply from the fact that the regulatory agency is accusing you of unscrupulous conduct.
I should clarify, I don't mean one that's bastardizing a pre-existing oral tradition. Separate entities altogether.
I feel like this organization was probably put into place. I don't know too much about it, but it's probably put into place because, there has been a history of people bastardizing, oral traditions and stories, and putting together a place where, people can be held accountable and things to be regulated. So that doesn't happen. I mean, we see like the IRB was made for research and to actually regulate people so that those things won't happen.
You bring up a phenomenal point, actually, and that, I guess, will segue us perfectly into talking about these oral histories. But most of the oral histories that we have revolving around indigenous cultures in North America were recorded usually around in the 1800s to the turn of the century by people who were just interested in indigenous cultures. And what they did was record these stories. And in more modern context, a lot of indigenous communities actually refuse to tell the stories to anyone outside of their culture. So we have this lens into these oral traditions that's about a century old that now no longer quite flies as these communities are trying to regain ownership over their own culture. So it's kind of this weird duality between wanting to protect and keep their traditions alive and the mistakes or unknowingness of their ancestors that did give up this knowledge in the first place.
Yeah, and I mean, and you got to think about, how were these, oral traditions recorded and portrayed, because we see that a lot in a lot of historical references about indigenous people, as there is a lens and a perspective thrown onto it that wouldn't have been there in the first place. And so I think that plays into a lot of why people want to protect those stories and, not let them out, is because I don't know how quite to phrase this, but it is kind of like indigenous peoples, are kind of thrown to the side and it's kind of taken and separated from them. If like you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, and the thing that I find that's very interesting as well is within archaeology, at least, a lot of these oral traditions are actually discounted. They're not taken as entire truth because, well, either the quote unquote data doesn't support that story, or something more along the lines of there's no way to validate these stories and these traditions. And there have actually been some examples that are incredible that actually show some truth to the nature. Like there have been countless stories passed on about like origin stories that correlate to actual events in history. Like I know in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of the tribes have oral traditions around when Crater Lake was formed. they talk about the land erupting and um, the volcano, and while they didn't necessarily have terminology for that specifically, they still described the events. Or God, there's so many different examples. One of the most prominent ones that stand out in my mind is actually from the Lakota tribe in the Dakotas. When they were forced on the reservations, there were stories of these people getting forced to walk hundreds of miles by United States military. And there was one story that was passed down from grandmother to daughter to granddaughter onto great-granddaughter. And what it was is the story dates back to the 1860s during the Dakota Wars. And the story is from this young girl's perspective, where her grandmother had fallen down and couldn't move and was struggling, and the soldiers, instead of helping her, stabbed her with a bayonet and pushed her over the side of this like cliff face or this bridge, and just left her and kept on going. And the story persisted and persisted, and when it came time to it, and when it came to evaluation, the stories from the soldiers' perspectives and the indigenous oral histories did not match up. And now with modern research and modern excavations, it's actually shown that these oral traditions have a lot more validity than what we had initially given it credit for. Sorry, kind of tangential there, but there's a couple of really prominent examples that stand out quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people put stock into, literary historical documentation because we give this an air of officialness that we don't give oral tradition, which, I mean, I think is incredibly unfair because anyone can write anything down and have any of those perspectives. So, you can give validity to, some people based on their, station or their job, but I don't think it's any more credible than oral tradition because it is something that is highly valued by the people that pass it on.
Well, and Winston Churchill was very famously quoted as saying, "History shall be kind to me, for I intend to write it." History is written from a victor's perspective. History is innately biased. And I'm sorry to anyone who believes that your history textbooks are 100% accurate, but
that is so not the case.
Yeah, do I have news for you?
History textbooks are famously inaccurate.
And the Pilgrims were welcomed by the Indians, and they had a big dinner.
Don't even get me started. I hate history books. But yeah, I mean, to get on to the actual oral traditions that we want to talk today, do you guys want to? We've already talked about some indigenous ones. Do you want to go over some others?
Well, we might as well start jumping in something a little less dark. And I would like to take a moment here to apologize in advance. We have taken examples from all around the world, and we do not speak almost any of the languages which these names and peoples do come from. So we will be mispronouncing things for the rest of this episode.
So sorry. We're trying, though.
Wait, you guys don't speak 20 different languages? Come on, get on my level.
I'm capped at 4.
And with that, I'm going to just take a stab here and make the jump to southeastern Oklahoma with another Native American tribe, the Choctaw. They have a strong oral tradition there, and one of excuse me. And one of the things that we found very interesting about the information with which the Choctaw do convey through their oral tradition is the inclusion of multiple origin stories, which is a very fun concept. They have 2 separate tales explaining how they, as a people, came to be, that they keep in this oral tradition. The first one is this migration of the Choctaw from a Western land to their ancestral homeland. And the second one is the creation of the first mound, which is a very culturally significant construct for them, and architectural feat. Oh, excuse me, my throat is coming back worse. I apologize.
Damn COVID.
Hey, we don't use that word around here.
COVID or damn? I'm not sure which one's worse.
Yeah.
I don't give a damn what you say.
And just it's a very interesting thing. One of the little tidbits that I did personally like to collect from researching out some of these different oral traditions are the languages that they are in, and the names of the languages. And so the Choctaw language that these stories are preserved in is known as, and this is the first thing I promise to butcher, Chata, which I cannot say. That has H's in places that I do not know how to pronounce in my very limited mono English. I will be making fun of my English all night. So I thought that was a very fun name for their language, and it was interesting, just how these people think of the concept of saying things with their oral traditions. Like, we think, a lot of times in Western culture and society, we think, the English speak English and are from England. The French speak French and are from France, where it's this monolithic unity between the name of a people and the language they speak. And it's not exactly the same everywhere else. And that's always been very fun and very interesting.
It's very fun when I hear people, they're like, oh, they're from Mexico, they speak Mexican. And it's just like, no, that's...
So, fun fact, this is actually one of my favorite facts, is in our home state, the state of Illinois, there is actually a law on the books that you are legally required to say, I speak American, not I speak English. If you say I speak English, you are actually breaking the law.
The freedom prize of language, everybody.
That is
God
so weird because technically we're not allowed to do that, I don't think. I think you can have an official language, but I don't think you're allowed to like outlaw the like language or the like name of a language.
Yeah, it is an archaic law that has yet to be repealed. And
there are a lot of strange archaic laws, but that is by far the oddest one that I've heard, mainly because like it doesn't make any sense to me.
Oh, obviously it stands out because I still remember it over a decade after learning it.
Wow.
All right. So what other oral traditions did we take a glimpse at?
Well, the one that I have done most of my thesis research on is actually the Ojibwe, which is an indigenous tribe in the northern Great Lakes region, mainly centered in like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan. But there are some bands in Canada, in Ontario, and in like North Dakota. They're a part of the Anishinaabe language tree, so that's how you were saying you do a lot of languages. And the interesting thing to me is they actually used to reside in Ontario and around the Toronto region before being displaced due to colonialism. There was a lot of pressures from the east between the English and the French and fur traders and other tribes being displaced that caused them to actually be forced west. But that's where their oral traditions come into play because their origin story tells of a land where food grows on the water, which is kind of an interesting thing because they were told, you must continue this migration until you go where you find food on the water. And this actually ended up being an allusion to manumin, which is the Anishinaabe word for wild rice. And kind of interestingly is the Lake Superior region. Guess what grows in abundance?
Chicken.
Ah, so
love that we
close,
get
but
this
it is rice. But if you
Ah.
put the two together, you get chicken and wild rice, and that's pretty darn good. But it's interesting because not only can you trace their origin story to this great migration and this thing that happened, but also it's still fairly recent. Like it's within the past 400 years, which I guess is a pretty decent time frame, but just the fact that this came through and now wild rice is such an integral part of their culture, an integral part of their history. Wild ricing is one of the main reasons and culprits for indigenous harvesting rules and the ability to continue gathering and to continue cultivating this food source. It's very interesting how much credence and how much credibility is lent to these stories when you look at the fact that it still is having a long-term impact.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is a good point to jump around the world real quick, just to give all of our viewers something of an idea of how large and just the magnitude of these oral traditions can be in the amount of information that they can retain. We're going to jump all the way over to Europe to a place that was once known as Yugoslavia. Children of the Cold War will remember Yugoslavia being that mess of a nation that consisted of everything that now exists north of Greece.
AKA the Balkans.
Anyways, back in the 1930s, there was a very famous oral history expedition into Yugoslavia, conducted by two people, the aptly named Albert Lord and a man named Milman Perry. We're sort of interested in the mechanics of how oral traditions work and how much information could be retained by people who essentially couldn't read. In Yugoslavia, they found and recorded 1,500 separate epic poems. Now, an epic poem it's a poem, as the name suggests, but it's one that consists of several thousand lines of poetry.
Oh, wow.
So, yes, one epic poem translated into today's term, the most famous of these are the Greek epic poems, which did make the jump from oral to literary tradition several thousand years ago. They are a couple hundred pages long. They are the same length as a full-fledged novel. So this is 1,500 textbooks worth of information that is just being transmitted by word of mouth during in Yugoslavia during this time. It is absolutely massive.
And the thing about that too is the way in which these groups are able to memorize that, or the way in which they're able to continue telling these stories, is they used a lot of mnemonic devices. They created a lot of formulaic phrases, typical scenes, recurring story patterns to really build out and flesh out these stories. And pretty much all oral traditions use that in some form or shape or way. So it's difficult, but then it's the repetition of hearing the stories hundreds, if not thousands of times, and the kind of cheat codes that help make it just a slight bit easier.
Yeah,
oh yes, definitely. There were patterns of cadence and sorry, Gwen.
Oh, it's okay. I mean, you'd have people that would be dedicated to like telling stories. Like that was like their main jobs or their main profession. And a lot of them would have those like, basic like plot beats to where you're telling it. but they would add different things like that were like more local or regional, or to like spice it up. And that's why you have slight variations in, a lot of these like oral stories, is because they change slightly with each person that told it, because you had those formulaic phrases and those kind of typical scenes, but they were a little bit different with each storyteller, but they still had those core principles, core values, core stories.
I also just realized, Colum, that we missed out on one of the most common ways in which oral traditions were spread, especially in Europe. The old D&D bard, who would use these stories and these traditions and add music as a form of telling those stories. And granted, a lot of what we think about today is, a bit embellished. There's a little bit of creative freedom to that, but it's, again, the basis of where we get a lot of music, too, because a lot of songs started off as stories, as tales.
Oh yes, definitely. A lot of oral traditions. An oral tradition can just be someone's sitting there or standing there and speaking, but a lot of them do also include song and dance and music. And I do believe we did find example of that in
Monty Python and the Holy Grail. The Tale of Sir Robin.
In Africa, actually, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, there is a art of oral tradition known as the Mwindo epic of the Nyenga people, which combines storytelling, singing, and dancing into one cohesive narrative to tell a singular story. And each part of this multifaceted performance has religious and historical significance to the Nyanga people, both practically from telling an important story, and also from the ritual context of anything that really has to do with religion is going to have a ritual context.
See, and that I think is interesting, the combination of the storytelling, song, and dance, because it's a form of entertainment, but it's also, like, again, the form of transmission of information.
Yeah, I mean, you guys mentioned the bardic and stuff. We also see it over in Brazil with the Cordel ballads, and that takes in, those small printed folios of stories strung together and then sung by makers and sellers to combine literary and oral tradition together, which I think is also really cool.
Yeah, it's pretty fun. It's basically if it's a good way to conceive of it, at least from like a Anglophone, Eurocentric perspective, is imagine if Shakespeare wrote a ballad and then proceeded to sell it on the street corner by singing it at people until someone bought it.
Oh, God, I love it. You love it.
I mean, honestly, I could see him doing that, knowing Shakespeare.
Yep. All right, he's going to sell the rights to A Midsummer Night's Dream by reciting the whole thing. World's most massive Cordell ballad right there.
Oh, yeah.
These are not that long, but still.
I could not imagine.
It's closer to a sonnet.
I could not imagine having to sing a Shakespeare epic. We had to recite a soliloquy of Hamlet, and that in itself was awful when I was in high school.
It may just be the dramatic person in me, but I would go on monologuing in the street if it meant that I could like make money off of that.
To be or not to be, whether it is nobler in the mind or the body. And that's about as much as I remember.
That is so little. I think that's what everyone knows about Hamlet.
Yeah, well, that's a whole different story. I found some alternative methods of doing that project.
Oh,
But
alternative methods like Spark Notes.
Not quite.
you gotta learn the cadence. You gotta learn the cadence, guys. Da 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 da. Yeah.
I don't
Or
think I
traditions rely on cadences. So does a lot of performative art, like
Oh,
Shakespeare's
yes.
plays. You got to learn to clap with the words.
It's like you're counting syllables. Yeah. Another short stories, though, because I mean, like the ballads aren't that long, but for peoples, Aboriginal peoples in Australia, that was like hard to say for some reason. Also used short stories known as songlines, and they use those to navigate Australia. So it's not just for you know mythological or historical reasons. It's also geographical and help like to help you navigate. And I think that's another thing because when you think back to I know now people would not be able to find their way without GPS. So when you think back, way back then before GPS, before, physical maps, how do we navigate a lot of these vast areas, especially when you have, traveling groups of people, because not everyone was sedentary. And so this is one of the ways that it can be done. And so they
Yes.
created a map using mythological and geophysical landmarks.
Yeah, and I'd like to say they didn't just create any map. They mapped an entire freaking continent
Oh yeah.
using nothing but the power of memorization and speaking.
But see, that's where the beauty in it, and like this is where there really is. I keep emphasizing credibility, and that's because this is something that I've done a lot of research on, and it's very passionate about. But like the fact that they're able to recreate this and to talk about it and to be able to tell you about it, really, it speaks so much. And I know with the Aboriginal people of Australia, one of their big sacred sites, Uluru. Oh god, I've
Uluru, yeah, I
butchered
think
that.
it's
Yeah,
Uluru. Close enough.
is basically this monolithic mountain in the dead center of the outback. But when you see it out of the entire landscape, like it really stands out, and they would geo-reference a lot of their stories to landmarks like that, and from there you can get literally anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And prior to the coming of satellites and GPS and that very fine-grained mapping system that we have today, these these essentially song lines and story maps were more accurate than anything we could draw. So it was a better map than what the literary tradition was producing during the time of, shall we say, Australia's interaction with England.
That is the nicest way of putting it.
Oh,
Well,
Colum, that
I'm
also
worried.
just-
I'm worried if we mention colonization too many times, we'll just get kicked out of the internet.
Well, speaking of
just get
colonization, and circling back to another story that I'm really way too familiar with, that is frustrating. Is you guys, have you ever heard of these two folks, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark?
No,
They might have gone on a little bit of an adventure, sailing up a few rivers, going to the Pacific coast.
Well, I remember they're the ones who
I
helped
seem to
Frodo
recall
get the ring.
Sacagawea.
So the interesting
important
thing
one.
about their journals is if you ever read them, they had tribal informants with them along the way. And these tribal informants would tell them where villages are. And they would go, I don't think so. I think it's on the other side. And, now that we have the we were able to, do archaeology. And before they flooded the Missouri River Valley, they did a bunch of archaeology. And they're like, their expedition says the village is over here, but actually we found it on this side of the river. So we think that they might have been a little mistaken. So, the good old white explorers exploring the new Western territories weren't listening to their tribal informants, and then, of course, the archaeology backed up their tribal informants.
Okay, you want to talk about overstatement here. A little mistaken is the nicest way I've ever heard of of a colonialist white person getting something wrong over pride.
I can't imagine any instance where that ever happened.
Captain Cook
I think
intensifies.
we might overload on sarcasm.
Captain Cook got what was deserving of. Got what he deserved.
Yeah. Also, if you would like us to do an episode on Captain Cook, comment Captain Cook in the description below so that we know you got this far.
I do want to point out, though, Captain Cook's name was a pretty good omen.
We're not going down this road yet.
Oh, I thought it was dinner.
Make them want it. Make them want it.
Make them beg.
Oh, God, Gwen.
I didn't mean it in like a mean way.
Make them beg.
Right. Anyway, moving on from Australia, we've talked a lot about stories and, even geography being recorded as a part of these oral traditions. But did you know that you can have an oral tradition law code? Oh, excuse me. I frogged my throat right there.
A law code?
Gwen has laid a curse on me.
The laws are these stories? Yes, my great-grandfather.
So for 500 years, the country of Albania did not have written law. The entire legal code of the country was orally transmitted from essentially one group of judges and lawyers and lawmakers to the next. It was not until the 20th century that they ever actually wrote it down.
That is intense.
That's really recent. That is really
it is.
recent.
It is very recent.
Although the 20th century was 23 years ago.
Yeah. So it was, within the last 100 years did they actually say, maybe we should put this on paper.
I wonder if some of this might have changed, because it says here that the punishment for stealing a loaf of bread is I don't reading? Is that what that says?
Yeah.
I feel like that would also make it. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, you can go ahead. I was just making fun of Justin because he deserves it.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, I feel like that makes it a bit more accessible too, because I can only imagine that, if that oral tradition is just passed to like lawyers and judges, if I'm on trial, like I would want to know a bit more about the law codes and specific things like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think part of the idea too is I'm not sure what the status of literacy of Albania was in the 15th century, but I'm assuming it wasn't particularly high. And if you don't need to be able to read to know the law, that might actually be a useful trait.
Yes.
And I cannot say for definitely for certain, but one of the things that was going on in the 20th century that might have prompted this change would probably be the rise of international organizations and agreements like United Nations and NATO and other pacts like that, wherein you're dealing with written word from a dozen separate languages for a dozen separate countries that need to be integrated into your own nation.
Colum, you're also foregoing the important thing that happened to Albania in the 20th century. They were a part of the Eastern Bloc. And,
Oh, yeah. And the Soviets.
Yeah.
I'm sure they had great tolerance for local traditions and countries, and always respected the rights, privileges, and traditions of the ethnic minorities in their dominion.
You just said like Soviets intolerance, and I couldn't help but laugh. Like just that like equation.
I just, they did do some work in trying to increase literacy rates in a lot of these third world countries, but,
by decreasing the population.
Look, you got to make some. Yeah, I can't even defend it. I could try, but I
not
can't.
Since the English Empire has
Whoa.
as a nation tried so hard to do so many wrong things at the same time.
Why does it always come back to the English?
Now. I've given up. I've given up. I tried to stay away from this, and you said no.
Those English bastards. We're just not going to have a single person listening from England.
Speaking of England, to get back to our oral traditions, England has some very famous oral traditions. I don't know if anyone's heard of a little-known person called King Arthur. You know.
Oh, I've seen his movie.
Yeah, it's a movie, whichever one you're talking about. I'm sure it's great.
The Holy Grail.
Yeah. So the legends of King Arthur were transcribed from an oral tradition, as well as Beowulf, I believe, in the 10th century.
Which, the cool thing about, like, King Arthur is it's one of those stories that has also transcended time. And also, another one from England is Robin Hood of Nottingham. There's a lot of fairly prominent stories, and, like, joking around about the movies of King Arthur, Monty Python did a pretty solid comedic sketch of that, but they did incorporate, as we were talking about, the song to transcribe the stories, and one of their storytelling methods was in transitionary scenes they would have a book with writing, and then it would transition into a song about whichever knight of the round table they were talking about in that moment. But
surprisingly, they put a lot of thought into their comedic sketches,
which I think is why it holds up so well after all this time.
Yeah. And just to jump in here to get us back to the oral tradition again, even more so. There's another prominent English oral tradition that made the jump to literature that doesn't get a lot of care and attention. This is the story of Beowulf, or Beowulf, depending on how you want to be English today. Which has to be the most classically strongman Viking story I've ever heard. That was not, that is not a Viking.
Yeah.
I mean, technically, he is kind of a Viking.
I was gonna say England,
it's weird. He's an English
century.
Viking. It gets confusing.
I mean, most of the Northern English were Vikings. Let's be real. The monasteries didn't have much of a chance.
And now we're doing another episode on Lindisfarne because we can't stop referencing things. Comment Lindisfarne if you want to hear more about that strange word below. If you guess the correct spelling, you win a prize. Namely our approval.
and Colum, another oral story that ended up transcending is that comes from my ancestral home of Scotland, and that is everyone's favorite Mel Gibson movie, Braveheart and William Wallace, which is it. Despite the Mel Gibson movie, which has its positives and negatives, William Wallace is a actual historic person. That the information of him has been passed down through these stories and through these traditions before eventually becoming written down and more cemented in the tale. But we love a good uprising against the English, don't we?
I mean, we've shat on the English a lot in this podcast, and it's a small run of just 4 episodes.
if we don't shit on the English,
episode we shit on the English. So.
At least once an episode, if not twice, then we haven't hit our quota.
Yeah. And speaking of the formerly English, one of the unique little manifestations of, and I probably shouldn't say little, but I'm going to keep doing so anyway. Of oral traditions that have occurred throughout the world is in South Africa, where the oral tradition of praise singers is used to create resumes for political leaders and also criticize your enemies. So you can literally, in South Africa, there's an entire essentially job of going through the streets and singing why someone should be removed from office. I personally, I've never actually witnessed an example of this, but I like to imagine it's something Les Miserable style. Of just, do you hear the people sing? It isn't. I know it isn't, but I want it to be, and I apologize for that.
I feel like at least now or in the future, if someone has to do that, they're gonna see Les Mis and they'll be like, yes, this was made for us. We shall do it in this style. Does anyone have a violin? Play behind me, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I guess that's also a fairly good segue column to another former British entity. The next 6 in a row are just going to be former British entities.
They did own half the world. So.
But let's go back to good old Ireland. Hey?
Oh, yay. Yep, jumping back to the British Isles because we go everywhere on the world here.
And yet somehow the British are everywhere.
And somehow we cannot escape them. We had hope in Albania, but then the Soviet Union arrived.
Okay.
Not one, it's the other.
Yep.
Why is it always the two of you getting in trouble?
Yep.
Go
ahead, Justin. No, bring it in.
I was going to say...
talk about my people.
Hey, our people... I am predominantly Irish. Like every other white person, I'm made of 20 different things, but predominantly Scottish and predominantly Irish.
Pick a side of the sea.
Our side is against England. That's my true disposition.
That's
the only way they can unite is against England.
Yes. But you had traditional traveling storytellers called Sean-chi. Shang-Chi?
It is not Shang-Chi in the Ten Rings.
Shang-Chi.
I'm sorry, that's Shang-Chi?
Shang-Chi.
I apologize.
This is actually one of the hardest things out on here to pronounce. H does a lot of weird things, as does the letters S and C.
Well, I know the first part is Sean, because it's S-C-A-N. But I haven't brushed up on my Gaelic. It's been quite a long time since I've been back in the Emerald Isle.
But essentially, these were traveling storytellers. These were people who went from town to town, county to county, kingdom to kingdom.
I've got tales if you've got gold.
Yeah.
And they just recited ancient lore and tales of wisdom alongside with news from across Ireland. So they were truly these Renaissance men of sorts that would travel across the lands far and wide, sharing histories and tales, but also gossip and news.
So they're a mix between the town crier and a bard.
Basically, yeah. They're like the mega bard.
Essentially, because keep in mind, most people, they didn't really have a lot of freedom of mobility several hundred years ago. There was no go on vacation across the country thing. No, you were born in your town, you stayed in your town. So if you want to know about the town and county over, well, someone's got to come in and talk about that.
Colum, I don't know if you're familiar, but are you familiar with the stories and tales of the fairies in Ireland?
Yes, I am very familiar with the fair folk. Which one of the various bound books of mythology, poetry, and just historical lore do you want me to rip off the massive bookshelf to my right?
Well, we could do a Reads episode on that, but do you want to give a quick rundown of that? Because that's another oral tradition that comes from the Emerald Isle.
Oh boy! All right, yeah. There's several here because there's the fair folk. There's the cycle. There's the poetic cycles, which the poetic cycles describe the essentially the inhabitants of Ireland, the settlements, the invasions of the Fomorians, which are essentially get translated by Christianity into demons, and the Tuatha, which get translated somewhere between humans, angels, and also demons, because Christianity equals everything is demons. Similar things happen with many of the stories of the fair folk and the fae. Uniquely Irish one that I think we are now obligated to speak on is the leprechaun. The tradition of the leprechaun has survived from simple stories of mischief and tricksters and little men who drink your booze in the basement at night when you black out. Definitely was not you who drank all the booze in the basement last night when you blacked out.
Of course not.
All sorts of little things like that. They survived. They've survived a whole lot of things to the point where for tourists now today in Ireland, you can go see leprechaun crossings and wait and watch for the little leprechauns.
Well, I actually brought up the fairy side of things because I've actually visited a fairy tree.
Oh, you visited a fairy tree and you returned alive.
Yes, unfortunately.
No, wait, that explains a lot.
You weren't supposed to know.
That explains slightly too much.
It's all coming together now.
Note to self, call Satanta. Gonna mark that down. I need to get us an Irish hero involved to fix you.
There we go.
Why do you gotta fix me, man?
Well, the reason
you've been enthralled.
are long.
Yes, the fairy trees. Wonderfully tied to nature. A lot of these oral traditional stories are, because a lot of what you're talking about is explaining the world. In essentially most oral traditions, you're trying to explain who you are, where you come from, and why the world is currently working like this.
Well, and speaking of ways to describe how the world works, and yet another former British protectorate, let's jump over to Israel and bring into a modern concept like the Judeo-Christian Bible, the book of Genesis and the 4 Gospels were transcribed from oral traditions. Correct me if I'm wrong, but pretty much all of the Old Testament was oral traditions prior to being transcribed.
I believe so. Yes. The book of Genesis and the 4 Gospels, I believe, and I am not a theologian here, but I do believe that those 2 particular examples stand out because they do retain a lot of the oral traditional cadences and repetitions. It's a part of why they are. It's a part of why they're beautiful. I believe these ones are a bit more hymn-like, though that might also be another section. There are a lot of parts to the Bible.
Well, and of course, it's like the biggest book around and like the most prominent example. So, of course, I had to just touch the bear on that one.
Yeah, and you know what? Since we're going in on this, there is currently a Judeo-Christian oral tradition in Judaism called the Seder, which is an event in the celebration of Passover, and it is the oral retelling around the dinner table, essentially, of the Jews' exodus from Egypt and winning their freedom from the Egyptian pharaohs. And one of the things that seemed very noteworthy when researching for this episode was not only is it active in what is considered one of the world's major predominant religions, Judaism, but it's also a form of oral tradition that involves a lot of audience participation. As the story of as the Seder and the story of this Exodus is prompted by a series of how should I say it, predetermined questions that are to be asked by the youngest child in the audience. In this case, typically in the family to the person telling the story to prompt the next part of the story each time.
Interesting. So they almost force the progression of the story based off these predetermined questions.
Yeah, like the story will progress, and then the child will ask a question that will amount to, in a much more specific terms than this, and then what happened?
It reminds me of like callback music where like you're telling a story and you call out someone's supposed to call back to you and then you like continue. So, do you
Like
guys know
almost
any
call and
music like that?
response.
Yeah, like call and response. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I forgot the word response for a second.
What is this
wait,
R
there's a
word you
word.
just used?
Sometimes I forget which language I speak.
Just
But
none
yeah,
of
none of them.
them.
Just throw all of them out. Yeah.
Well, and Colum, I think it's time you tackle the beast, the one that you are ever so adamant on, and the one you stand on your little soapbox for. The one that you're kind of familiar with.
I love how you translate the existence of a bachelor's degree into ego. Makes me wonder what you're doing with your master's.
Oh, I don't know.
I don't
None
think
of
his
us do.
ego could get bigger. I'm just gonna be honest.
No,
Yep.
I'm beating around the bush. Colum is quite in tune with ancient Greek history, so I figured this would be a pretty good segue into probably the most well-known oral traditions that people may not have realized started as oral traditions. But I feel like most people have heard of the Iliad, heard of the Odyssey.
And they're definitely familiar with the Greek pantheon. I think almost everyone is.
Yeah.
Yep. So now we go to Greece, the basis of European culture. Welcome to part 1 of 210 of my TED Talk.
There's the ego. Okay.
We will be going here and then never leaving, as the history of this nation is essentially a black hole. Sucks in everything else and tries to tie to it. So, we've talked earlier today about how the oral traditions included epic poems in Yugoslavia, and that these are several thousand line poems that go on for hundreds of pages when actually transcribed. So it's time to talk about the most famous of them. These are the Homeric epics, known today as the Iliad and the Odyssey. They tell of a very real mythologized, of course, account of the Trojan War between Greece and Troy. This war did happen, and we do know where Troy is. I will shut up. We are not having this conversation. If you utter his name, and we have to make a third mini-sode off of this, I swear.
Heinrich Schulman.
All right, and now we have to explain who that is. Yes, there was an archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann. I use the term archaeologist in the loosest possible sense of man with dynamite wants gold.
He did great research in figuring out where the city was, and his form of excavation was lighting sticks of TNT and just yeeting them into the site.
Yep.
And just blowing
and tossing
massive holes.
Yep. And tossing the bones of the dead aside to rip the jewelry from their fingers.
Oh my god, yes. Granted, he is one of the founders of modern archaeology and did important work and helped drum up a lot of support. But oh my god, when you talk about TNT and archaeological sites.
All right. So back to the oral tradition.
Sorry.
So the Homeric epics, as they are known, these two works, they speak of the Trojan War in a very mythologized account. These works date back about 600 years or so from when they were from when the war first occurred that they were based off of to when they were transcribed. So there's a 600-year oral tradition to these cornerstones of literature, essentially, these days. They are called the Homeric. They're called the Homeric epics because they are attributed to a traveling storyteller named Homer, not a Simpson. I feel the need to mention that.
No.
And Homer is they were sorry, my lungs are starting to break down again.
Oh no.
It's okay. It's okay. These and most and when they were recorded, they actually managed to inspire subsequent literature based off of the the formerly oral tradition of the Homeric epics in the Romans, who had what is considered their greatest poet, Virgil, write the Aeneid, which is a retelling of the same story from the Trojan perspective. It's not as popular, and it goes about as well for the Trojans as you think. Another interesting note is the oral tradition for the Homeric epics had become so mythologized around Homer himself, this presumably not historical figure, that most oral traditions from Greece during that time, when they were first transcribed, were attributed to Homer, which is why his name also appears on things such as the Homeric hymns, which are a set of religious odes to each of the individual deities that would govern aspects of life for the Greeks. He essentially becomes a part of the oral tradition, where the storyteller actually becomes a part of the story, which is a very fun thing for the Greeks.
Oh, yes.
Yep. And because we are in the ancient world right now, I feel we should rewind the clock a bit further to one of the first acts of oral tradition to ever make the jump to a literary tradition to become writing. We go to Mesopotamia and the city of Uruk for the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known stories in existence. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells of the first king of what was often considered to be the first city at the time, the city of Uruk, and it is transcribed onto a series of tablets, clay tablets, in what is one of the earliest forms of written language. So this was one of the first times where a literary tradition could exist, and it didn't have to be oral. It didn't have to be speaking, and it could, I guess, expand.
Yeah.
It's also kind of cool because there's actually a museum in the city of Chicago called the Oriental Institute, which, fun fact for those of you who don't know, the Middle East used to be called the Orient, like you would think of Oriental. But some of those original tablets with the Epic of Gilgamesh are within that museum. So, kind of neat, kind of cool, and it's completely free to go visit.
I smell a field trip.
We're going on a trip.
Yeah, we're going to go see one of the oldest written stories in history.
You know what? Maybe we could do a live video of that.
Yeah, that'd be great. I remember I took a mythology class in high school because I was lucky enough to have a teacher that, could pull their weight around and was so invested in mythology that the Epic of Gilgamesh is the first one we were taught. And she actually brought in like is it Sumerian or cuneiform? I can't remember which they were written in.
Sumerian is they're both, I believe, would be accurate terms for this, as cuneiform is a form of writing, like saying you have an alphabet.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that I was getting like the right words, but she actually like had us like learn specific ones and showed us what it was written in when it was transcribed onto those tablets, which I think was just a really cool way to interact with the story as well.
Yep.
And just a brilliant story. I definitely suggest people go read it or listen to it. Like our video that's going to be on it, or
Oh yes, and you will
shameless
definitely
plugging.
be able to do that on our channel in the near future. As those of you who have witnessed our 42 negative confessions video, there will be another Historical Humans Reads video coming out in the near future on the first tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So if you want to start in there, that's going to be a thing.
And that video should be live on Friday the 28th. So if anyone wants to check that out, we'll have it published on our YouTube channel at 12 p.m. Central. So be sure to check it out. Of course, we like the supplemental videos on things that we want to get more in depth on and talk a little bit more in detail, but that just maybe don't quite make the cut despite our multiple tangents.
Yes. We talk a lot that's not necessarily on the exact topic that the episode is on, but it's all very fascinating, important things too. So more than
speaking of talking a lot, I want to try and get in just one more example of oral traditions that we did do some research on for the Basque, a ethnic group and territory currently within the boundaries of Spain.
Free Basque.
The Basque oral tradition does show that, like, how should I say this? That it very much exemplifies that literary and oral traditions can and do really jive very well together and coexist in harmony. As the Basque have something called the Bertsolaritza, which is it's a poetry contest of improvised poetry that is broadcast nationally every 4 years, like almost like it's their own Olympics. And the purpose of the poetry is to discuss political issues, culture, the culture of the Basque, the history surrounding them. It's very much in conjunct. It's in a very literate society. It's in a very what we would consider a very modernized society, and it's a very big part of who and what they are as a people, is this tradition, and this celebration of it takes place with a lot of things that we wouldn't think would coincide with an oral tradition, like television and broadcasting. And it just goes to show that that the oral tradition doesn't have to take a back seat, or it isn't something that is pushed to the side. It's it can be loud and proud and as prominent as it wants to be.
Wait, you're saying the Basque can be loud and proud in a region that wants to be independent from Spain?
Yeah. Who would have thought revolutionary fever would go hand in hand with rising nationalism? Yeah, I'm not getting into that, okay?
Well, I think one of the other things that it really showcases, especially in what we're talking about in this episode, is that oral tradition is very alive today. It is not a past thing. So I think a lot of people think that it is a very past thing that people did around a fire with cave and stones, like Justin brought up earlier in this episode. And that we may have like modern like versions, but it is still a very prevalent thing in all our societies today.
Yeah. And now, do we wrap up this episode with talking about our last two examples?
I have to head off for this episode, so I will see you all next time.
All right.
But definitely continue.
Yes. We can have a good evening.
Yeah. Good luck, Gwen.
And so
All right,
two
now
remain.
and now there are two. One more, and I shall rule the historical humans universe.
Oh no! If I go missing, it was Colum's fault.
Yep.
So I guess I'll dive into the Metis, and then if you want to tackle the Zuni, we'll be
Sure.
good.
We can go at that.
So the Metis, which are an indigenous First Nations in Manitoba in Canada, which is combined indigenous and European traditions since about the 17th century. Which, kind of a fun fact, is Métis is actually a French term for mixed blood, which isn't necessarily an offensive term, but it is akin to like mulatto or like other mixed race groups. However, they have since gone on to form their own independent culture and identity, and they actually use the term to identify themselves. And the first Métis were children of indigenous people and Europeans, primarily the French, because what the French really liked to do when they were fur trading is one single fur trader would have a different wife in every village. And just, as he was going on his trade route, he'd stop and visit each family that he started and, just shared the love over and over and over again.
Some stereotypes are earned.
But it's kind of interesting because their language is Michif or French Cree, which is a Creole language that combines French and Cree. And they have stories that contain nonlinear narratives and multiple interpretations, which is really common amongst indigenous oral traditions. And this is used as a vehicle to pass on legends and histories and even family remembrances. So you would be able to track your family lineage through these stories. And they were told through a group of tribal elders who were referred to as the old people. Take that one, Grandpa. But certain of those narratives and certain of those stories were sacred and only told at specific times to specific people. Kind of what we talked about earlier about how a lot of modern indigenous groups refuse to share that information with outsiders or academics because it is sacred and held to specific groups. And I think that's a pretty abridged, spark-noted version for the Métis.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Well, I love that you just like copy-pasted over part of the section there. That's a fun notes jump. All right. All right. Some things got jumbled there, guys. Hang on a second. All right. So the next group we wanted to talk about would be the Zuni. This is a Pueblo Indian group of the Penutian language. They live presently near the Arizona border of New Mexico, and one of the various things that you see in oral traditions is they recount stories explaining how the world came to be or how these people came to be, or of heroes or deeds or other things. The Zuni, they focus on stories displaying the correct social behavior. A lot of times in stories and in traditions, characters, the stories tend to talk a lot about the bad things that happen to you when you break social rules. Whereas the Zuni, the impression I got from the information we found was that a lot of their stories tend to focus more on how life can work out for you if you obey social rules, which is sort of the opposite of how we usually think of things when we as Westerners tell stories. We think of, oh, you break the rules. Here's your comeuppance. Here's your punishment for being, greedy or cowardly or whatever negative thing.
Actually, to be honest, that kind of makes sense in a lot of ways, especially with how in a lot of Western cultures you have the stories that do have lessons attached to them, that do have, those consequences of the main character. It may not be as upfront as like, you committed these social sins, here's your punishment, more or less like, here is the moral of the story.
Yeah, essentially the idea of, instead of showcasing, what happens to you when you're selfish, it would showcase what happens to you when you're compassionate.
I don't know. That's a little too spicy for me.
Yeah. People being nice. Who knew that would be a thing?
Yeah, no, that freaks me out. We don't do that around here. But I think that's probably a good place for us to pause it here. And I just want to say thank you guys if you stuck around this long. And if you wanted to see any of our supplemental content, be sure to check us out on YouTube at Historical Humans, Twitter and Instagram at History of Humans. Follow our social medias. We'll have all the links down below or in the show notes. And be sure to like and subscribe and follow on Spotify, Anchor, all the social media platforms, because we want to hear back. We want to hear what your thoughts are, or if there are any topics that really jump out that you want to see or check out, let us know. We're trying to expand our horizons, and that's where Colum here really took the charge on historical reads, H.H. Reads. Which almost sounds like H.H. Holmes, but that's a different podcast.
There is no connection in any way. We just, are based in Chicago, and never see more than one room.
Oh, although I should probably write that down. But yeah. Anyways, thank you guys for watching, and we'll catch you all in 2 weeks with another episode. Keep on the lookout. We got a special Valentine's Day episode coming. Any little hints or spoilers you want to drop, Colin, before I end the recording?
Absolutely not. We are just, in Chicago doing Chicago things for a Valentine's Day special in Chicago. We are based out of Chicago, Illinois, in the United States of America, and there's absolutely nothing that has ever happened here on Valentine's Day.
Especially not in Chicago. Well, anyways, with that being said, and on that disappointing bombshell, we'll catch you all next time. Peace.